welcome, Paul.
Thank you.
I understand you're the curator of vertebrate zoology at the Canterbury Museum.
That's right.
What's a vertebrate?
A vertebrate is an animal with a backbone, as opposed to an invertebrate, which is an animal without a backbone.
Thank you. And so that's things like birds, lizards.
Birds, lizards, fish? Mammals, we're vertebrates, as opposed to the bugs, slugs, squid, mollusks.
So someone else looks after those?
Yep, Simon, who you've interviewed earlier.
Great. And how did you get into that?
I went to the university system. I did my PhD at Otago University on mutton bird biology, and I've always had an interest in the animals of New Zealand, in particular the birds.
And so you have a particular interest in birds?
That's right.
Well, do we have anything else besides birds in terms of land animals in New Zealand?
In New Zealand, we don't have any mammals that are indigenous. We do have 3 species of bat. One of those 3 species is now extinct. But work that I've been doing in central Otago on fossils from the Miocene shows that we actually used to have mammals in New Zealand.
How long ago?
About 16 million years ago. There was a species of mammal that we think was a very primitive type, basically a living fossil. And we don't know how long that lasted in New Zealand, but it certainly was of a Gondwanan origin, and it probably became extinct sometime between 16 million years ago and probably the glacial period about 1 million years ago.
So maybe too cold?
Exactly, yeah.
What sort of mammal was it?
It was a small mammal about the size of a rat, and it was very interesting because it had hind limbs that were actually more like a kangaroo's. So we've actually nicknamed that animal the waddling mouse.
Waddling?
The waddling mouse. Because of the way it walked, we think rather than walking or hopping, it actually waddled.
Endearing. And so typically, your job seems to range very widely. If you're looking at creatures from the Miocene, do you look at current living vertebrates as well?
Yeah, I do. I work on albatrosses on the Chatham Islands. I've got a project working out there funded by the Ministry of Fisheries, looking at the survival and behaviour of the albatrosses on the Chatham Islands. And that's funded by the Ministry of Fisheries because albatrosses are being affected by fisheries bycatch, and we're looking at the survival of those species which are being affected by fisheries, and we're also looking at where those animals fish. We're actually putting satellite devices on their backs and working out exactly where they fish.
Now, I mean that's very interesting work, and I'm just wondering, in terms of being a curator, sometimes maybe the public perception is that you're working in a dusky room full of stuffed animals. I guess you do that as well. But so how do you, if you're doing research into albatross, how does that sort of fit with the museum?
Well, as curator, my job is first and foremost to look after the very valuable collections of Canterbury Museum. But it's also important to have some research interests outside the museum to enable some credible science to be coming from Canterbury Museum, and also to have topics that I can discuss with people like you and the general public. The general public can't get enough of albatrosses, and I get a lot of media coverage out of my albatross work.
Great. Well, I'll move on from albatrosses today, as interesting as they are. If I look around Christchurch today, I see birds like goldfinches, sparrows, blackbirds, thrushes. Obviously, it's pretty different to what was here beforehand, because those are European birds. What happened? How did they get here?
Well, all those species were brought to New Zealand, mostly between 1870 and 1890. When the Europeans first arrived, they found a very diverse avifauna, but very quickly, only within the first 30 to 40 years of intensive European agriculture and colonisation of New Zealand, and in particular Canterbury, most of those species of bird had been gone. Most of the native species were disappearing, and you read in the media reports, suggesting that it was a blitzkrieg, and that if they didn't do something very quickly, all the species of bird would be gone. So societies were set up, these societies called acclimatisation societies, and the aim was to bring in species of bird and other animal to replace those native species that were disappearing so rapidly. The thought was, if they didn't actually do something about this, then our gardens and our natural environment would have no animals within it whatsoever.
So what were those birds that disappeared in the first 30 years off the Canterbury Plains?
Well, on the Canterbury Plains, there are records of people starting their orchards and huge numbers of kakariki flying in and eating all the apples.
The parakeet.
Yeah, the small parakeets, which are now really quite rare. You can go days up an Arthur's Pass without seeing one, but in the 1860s and 1870s, they were incredibly abundant. And there were other species like, for example, the tomtit and robin that were common in the Port Hills right up until the 1870s. And it seems like the most important thing that happened was the introduction of the mustelids, the weasels, stoats and ferrets. And only within 10 to 20 years, most of those species were gone from Christchurch.
So why did the settlers bring animals like that?
Well, unfortunately, they actually brought rabbits first, and rabbits became very abundant in the 1870s, and they thought, well, the logical thing to do is to bring the natural predator of the rabbit, the mustelids, the stoat and the ferret especially. They brought those. They didn't have much effect on the rabbits, but they certainly did on the native birds, unfortunately.
So it's like an old lady who swallowed a fly, and
exactly.
On it goes.
Exactly.
It's a sad story.
Yeah, it is. It's very sad, and it's not something we can reverse very easily.
Yeah. So if I'd come here, presumably the pre-European settlers, the Polynesian settlers, Maori, also had an effect on birds. And what was that story?
That was at least as devastating as the arrival of Europeans. But when the first Maori arrived in New Zealand, they found basically a land that was overflowing with birds. Admittedly, a land that was very difficult to get around because it was mostly forested. The first Polynesian peoples that anthropologists call the moa hunters were indeed moa hunters. They mainly ate moa, and we find in their middens work that myself and at the Canterbury Museum and others have been doing at Wairau Bar, an important Polynesian site in Marlborough, that those people were eating large numbers of moa, but also other species which were gone very quickly after human arrival. For example, there was a giant flightless goose, nearly the size of a sheep.
Really?
There was the giant half-seagull, one of the largest birds to ever fly, 25-kilogram bird with a 3-metre wingspan, a giant predator.
What would they eat?
Well, we think that they mainly ate moa, actually. They were certainly adapted to eating large carrion species. They had special flaps over their nostrils, which is a feature that you see in things like vultures. And they also had incredibly strong talons, and we think that those were probably adapted for attacking and eating moa. When we talk about moa, we're not talking about a single species of bird. We're actually talking about 9 or 10 species, which ranged from the size from a very large turkey right up to the giant moa that was nearly 3 metres tall when it stood erect.
So it was a pretty different country.
It was a very, very different country, and also a country that was unique in the world. There was no other country which didn't have dominant mammals in the ecosystem. And all the places, all the ecological niches, as we call them, in the ecosystem that would have been occupied by mammals, we found a bird. The sheep that you find in a European ecosystem, that niche was occupied by moa. The eagle, the giant eagle, occupied the niche, sort of equivalent of a large predator like a cat. And we even had the niche of an animal like a mouse being occupied by a tiny wee flightless bird we had in New Zealand called the Lyle's wren.
Which was a flightless wren, so it would walk around on the forest floor.
It would walk around on the forest floor, scuttle around probably, and be virtually exactly like a mouse. It would occupy the same ecological niche.
So the birds just change their behaviour to fill whatever
exactly,
niches were available.
Exactly, yeah. And then when all those birds were eradicated, those niches became available.
And hence the acclimatisation societies trying to fill those.
They probably weren't thinking about it using the exact terminology that we use today. I mean, that's modern ecological terminology. But certainly they recognised in the early gardens of the early settlers in Christchurch, there were no birds. And there were important roles that birds fulfil in a garden, which weren't getting carried out. At the same time, of course, as the early settlers brought in plants and other things, they also unfortunately brought in a number of pests. For example, they brought in the helix, the land snail, they brought in the slugs, and they brought in various species of insect. And in this period, in the 1880s and 1890s, agriculture was really being seriously affected by the fact that these pests had nothing to eat them. So it was really important, even from an agricultural point of view, that the acclimatisation societies brought in something that could...
starlings
and thrushes and blackbirds, because these are really important predators on the common garden pests that you find in every garden today.
Right. Going back to the sort of prehistory, how do we know so much about what was here before? I mean, how do you find out about these things? The 12 or more kinds of moa. There are things which Europeans have never set eyes on.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Well, there's three sources that we have for our knowledge on New Zealand's prehistoric avifauna. Firstly, the Maori middens themselves, the early middens of the Maori people.
Just explain what a midden is.
Okay, a midden is just a rubbish heap. We've got a very large midden in Canterbury and Happy Valley in North Canterbury. It's considerably larger than a Maori midden, but it's exactly the same process. And at that archaeological excavation I was just talking about at Wairau Bar, we spent 3 weeks digging in a rubbish heap. And it told us incredible things about the diet of the early Maori people. We found large numbers of moa bones. We also found large numbers of bones of many of the other species. And we found also the various other things that they've been doing. That we found the remains of various artifacts that they've been making, necklaces that they've been making, and also, of course, large amounts of shellfish, which they'd also been eating as well as the bird.
So that's one way.
That's one way. That's what we definitely know that the Maori people were eating. But the actual natural environment of New Zealand, there are two important sources of information on that. The first is the cave deposits that we find right through the country, from Fiordland right up into the far north. These caves are basically natural traps for birds and other animals. A bird that falls through the forest floor into a tomo, into a large pit, gets stuck down there and dies, and its bones are quite well preserved in the basic soil which we find in a cave.
So when you're saying basic soil, do you mean because of the pH, the acidity?
The pH is very basic because it's limestone, exactly. It's almost the perfect environment for someone to store bones in.
So the bones don't rot away?
The bones don't rot away, and in New Zealand we have bones that go back 25,000 years in some of these caves. Unfortunately, due to the glacial nature of New Zealand, we don't have records going back further than 25,000 years. In Australia, there are actually caves which have a record going back 500,000 years. So caves are an incredibly useful way of understanding the prehistoric fauna of New Zealand. And the other thing that's quite unusual in New Zealand is that we have quite significant swamp deposits of animals. In particular, in North Canterbury, we have the Pyramid Valley moa swamp, which is a natural deposit of moas which have walked probably down to quite a muddy waterhole. They've got bogged in the waterhole, much like cows and sheep do sometimes in waterholes today. And then they've been basically sucked right down into the mud. The mud's covered them over. It's been quite an anoxic environment, with low amounts of oxygen. It's actually also quite basic because it's in limestone country. And those bones are perfectly preserved. They look like the day that the birds died, honestly.
And don't you sometimes find even the contents of the stomach preserved?
We find the contents of the stomach. We find some incredibly... there was a bird found which still had an intact, or not intact, quite crushed, but all the pieces of an egg inside it. And we find the chicks of some of these birds that have died along probably with their parents. And we also have the foods that these birds were eating, both, as you say, in the gizzards, but also preserved alongside the bird, the leaves and seeds of all the trees and plants that were in the forest around them.
So it's giving you information about the
whole environment
as well, which may have completely changed.
Exactly, and it has completely changed. We know that for a fact. That the environment of North Canterbury is somewhere that was now a very dry area. But we know from looking at Pyramid Valley and other sites that in fact matai, a swamp tree, was one of the commonest trees throughout that area. Something, there isn't a matai tree for 200 miles in any direction now.
Yes. Well, Christchurch, when I was a kid in Christchurch, all our drains were sort of cut straight down into the ground with either concrete or wooden sides, and we were always warned not to fall into them. We don't see those these days, and a lot of the birds, the water birds, have disappeared, and they've made a comeback, certainly in my lifetime. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, sure. There was a approach in the late 70s and early 80s by the council based on the idea that the earlier methods of controlling water flow through Christchurch were actually flawed, and that what was really required were large holding basins for water that was flooding. And also based on scientific findings that have been happening right through the 20th century, we now know much more about flooding. The original idea of flooding was to control it, you needed to have water courses which got rid of the water out of the area that could be flooded as quickly as possible. But we now know that by vegetating water courses and also by having these holding areas, you can actually reduce flooding. And you can also improve the environment of the area around. And this is what's been happening in Christchurch since the 80s. There's great improvement in the environment of the rivers, as you're talking about, with plantings, the removal of those horrible wooden surrounds, and also the improvement of the sewage ponds, which have now been turned into a wonderful nature reserve. And this has had an incredibly positive effect on the avifauna of Christchurch.
So give us an example of the species that have come back.
Well, the first one to come back, which surprised everyone, was the New Zealand scaup, the little dark...
It's like a little black rubber duck.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. Lovely little duck. Incredibly rare in Christchurch in the 1970s. You wouldn't have seen one if you'd gone all day. But now they're breeding, and they started to breed in huge numbers at the Bromley sewage ponds as soon as they were improved. And that pool of birds at Bromley has moved out along all the waterways, especially as they improve. And now it's virtually the commonest duck you can see on the Avon. An incredible success story. Not just a success story based on the improvement of the waterways, but also probably because the birds themselves have actually changed their behaviours. When they used to be a shy, retiring bird that required real isolation from humans to actually breed, they're now, breeding quite
parks
and parks, probably within 200 metres of where we're talking today. They're happily bringing up their chicks on their ducklings on the Avon, and it's an incredible success story.
And what about these guys, the Paradise Shelduck?
The Paradise Shelduck here. This is the next one to really take off. A species, Paradise Shelduck, even in the early 90s, was a rare species around Christchurch, and with the improvement in the waterway and probably also a little bit of a change in behaviour on the part of these birds, they're now everywhere. When I came to Christchurch 10 years ago, you couldn't see one. We now know of at least 40 breeding pairs within the central Christchurch region.
They seem to nest in unusual places.
Yeah, they definitely do, and this is part of the change in behaviour. That there's a pair, for example, breeding on top of the Provincial Council building, right in the centre of Christchurch, only one block from Cathedral Square. And that's something that they never used to do before. It's a little bit annoying for the custodian of the Provincial Council buildings because they actually block the drains. But that behaviour, it's quite interesting because they're actually sort of modifying their natural behaviours. Paradise ducks in the country breed up in trees, and little hollows in trees, or even holes in trees. And they're now thinking that a rooftop of a building can actually sort of double as a tree. And this is perfectly natural for them because the chicks are actually adapted that shortly after they hatch, they hop down out of the tree and land on the ground. They can fall 10, 15 metres without being injured, and then the whole family will walk off from the roof, from below the rooftop where they've jumped and back and down.
Has anyone figured out how they do that?
Well, they're actually, when they first hatch, they're probably have this much body and that much fluff. So they're really very light. That the actual impact of them falling with that lightness and that amount of fluff around them, and in fact they actually do wag their tiny wee little wings, which are completely useless, and they actually don't injure themselves when they fall.
Great.
Yeah, no, it's an incredible success story, and no one would have imagined 20 years ago that a species such as this, a large duck, which Cantabrians are actually getting used to now. I think they were a bit shocked when they first started seeing them. But
they're great parents, aren't they?
They're incredible good parents, yeah. And they have beautiful little ducklings, they're little black and white striped ducklings. Yeah. You'll be in the Botanic Gardens now and you'll see 100 tourists surrounding a family, and there won't be any... The parents will be protective, but they won't be freaking out.
Yes. And what's this other bird you've got here beside you? It looks like a rook or something.
Yeah, this is a rook. This is actually a species... We're talking about how a number of species got introduced to Christchurch. Yeah. Okay, sure. Okay.
And what's this other bird you've got here? This large black...
Well, we talked about sort of success stories amongst introduced birds, species such as the blackbird, the starling, and the thrush. Mm-hmm. This was one that was introduced because we thought it could be quite successful. In the UK and Europe, the rook, this is a rook, a large corvid, is a very popular agricultural bird which gets rid of a lot of pests on farms. Unfortunately in New Zealand it built up very large colonies where it became established, known as rookeries.
Yep.
And was actually having quite an adverse effect on the very few native species that survive. In Christchurch, and the Canterbury area as a whole, they've now been eradicated. But in the North Island, those eradications have been less successful, and in fact there's still quite large rookeries, especially in the Hawke's Bay.
Right.
It'll be a matter of time before we discover, exactly how severe the impact of those rookeries is going to be. But it's possible that, especially in the North Island, the population might have got to beyond the level that it'll be very easy to eradicate them.
Right.
So although some of those acclimatisation society introductions were successful, there were some that weren't. There were certainly some that the actual introductions weren't successful. That's quite an interesting story. Of the 100-odd species that they actually introduced, only 30 or so have been successful.
So tell us what we might have had
we could have
been successful.
We could have had the English robin, the robin redbreast. We could have had various species of the small English tits, such as the blue tit. We could have had the American cardinal. Sorry, the bright red cardinal, a bird which is very common in America, in North America today. We could have had about 10 species of Australian birds that probably wouldn't have been very popular. Probably the most bizarre of those was where emu were introduced into the wild in New Zealand. And there are a few species of mammal that were also introduced that weren't successful. For example, the European squirrels, and also, fortunately, mink. One of the mustelids like the stoat and the weasel that is probably far more aggressive than the stoat and the weasel, and would have probably wiped out absolutely every species of New Zealand bird there was.
Right. Didn't take.
No, thank God it didn't take.
Yes.
And one of the reasons for that is quite interesting that they brought these boats on the birds on the same boats that the people came out on, and sometimes they brought 100 birds on a boat, and by the time we actually got to New Zealand, only 2 or 3 were alive. They released those 2 or 3 and
hope for the best.
No, hope for the best, and generally those sort of introductions didn't happen.
Yeah.
It didn't work.
So in terms of displaying this material at the museum, I mean, how do you go about that, explaining that to the public? What's in your collections?
Well, the majority of our collections are historic. We've got a large collection of material from Walter Laurie Buller, a fairly famous early collector who collected many of the species that were becoming rare in the New Zealand forests in the 1880s, 1890s.
So he shot a few of the last remaining ones to make sure people could see them.
And he was actually shooting them and selling them as a business. But actually, he wasn't actually shooting most of them. He was actually buying them off people, a number of contacts that he had. And but he was, to a certain degree, just documenting extinctions that probably would have happened already. He gets a bit of a bad press, old Buller, but the truth is that without his collecting, we wouldn't have the knowledge about many of the species of bird that have become extinct in New Zealand because no one else cared.
And the loss was occurring because of predators and habitat
loss. Yeah, precisely. For example, huia. You quite often read that huia were wiped out by collectors, but they weren't. The truth is, in the south of the North Island, where they were restricted to by the 1880s, 1890s, habitat destruction was on a scale, never seen before in New Zealand, and
so the Crown fires.
The huge fires, the 100-mile wood disappearing in a year, these birds, these large birds like huia, required large areas of forest, and by the 1890s, turn of the 20th century, there wasn't any of that forest around. So the hunting that was going on for a few specimens wasn't the ultimate cause of their demise.
Well, thank you very much for coming in and talking about
no problem at all.
Vertebrates, and particularly birds.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting. And I guess the struggle now is to try and keep what we have.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's definitely a battle. I mean, we win battles occasionally, like the kakapo. The kakapo now over 100 birds, and that's an amazing sight. But there's actually still a number of species which are in much worse state on the New Zealand mainland than they were 10 years ago.
Yes.
Yellowhead, blue duck, Brown's heel, all of these, and then in fact, of course, the iconic kiwi, all of these could be gone within 20 years unless a lot of work is done right now.
So what do you think? What do you mean by a lot of work? What do you think needs to happen to keep those species on the mainland?
I think we need to learn cleverer, quicker ways of controlling predators. I think we need to invest a lot more in habitat protection, and I think we really need to invest more in the survival of these birds.
Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure.